Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 106 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today I'm speaking with Michelle Black. Michelle is a mother of two boys and the widow of Staff Sergeant Brian Black, who was killed in an ambush along with three other Special Forces soldiers in Niger in October 2017, in an event which drew the attention of the entire world to a desolate and chaotic corner of Africa. Michelle sought answers in the aftermath of her husband's death, but the answers she was given only led her to more questions. She eventually decided to find out for herself what really happened to her husband's ODA and learned that bad assumptions, bad intelligence, and bad decisions at several levels resulted in terrible consequences for the men on the ground. I invited Michelle onto the podcast to discuss her book, Sacrifice: The Green Berets, A Fateful Ambush, and a Gold Star Widow's Fight for the Truth. It tells the story not just of the ambush that cost the lives of 4 men and changed countless others, but also the search for the truth behind an investigation which seemingly sought to protect those who were most responsible for the events of that terrible day. But before we dive into Michelle's story, I want to tell you all about my favorite fragrance for daily wear. It's called Novichok by Clandestine Laboratories. Novichok is distinctive and combines notes of cocoa powder, chocolate almond tort, rose, jasmine, cinnamon, tonka bean, Peru balsam, and musk tonkin. Unlike some of the other colognes I've worn in the past, I found that Novichok stays with me all day, which was a pleasant surprise. If the name sounds familiar to you, then you might already know why I was so happy to find this company and support them. The name itself comes from the very well-known Russian nerve agent Novichok, which has been used in recent years in several assassination attempts, which I've covered here on the podcast in previous episodes. The name is spelled differently, but rest assured, once you put this on, you'll still make a killer impression wherever you go. Novichok is made in small batches by Clandestine Laboratories and, like their entire lineup, is available only via direct order. If you're not sure which of their fragrances is right for you, you can also check out the Discovery Stash, 6 different mini bottles at one great price, which is perfect for finding your signature scent. So make sure to check them out either via a link in the show notes of this episode, at their website, clandestinelaboratories.com, or on Instagram at Clandestine Laboratories. Michelle, I'm so glad that we could get together to discuss this today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. I have to admit, I did not know very much about the events you lived through until I read the book, but it left me really upset over the whole situation, honestly, upset that something like this could happen when it absolutely should have been prevented, honestly.
I completely agree. It's obviously affected me pretty. It's changed the whole course of my life. So
yeah, certainly that was incredibly clear reading through the book, and it's very important, I think, to understand the personal cost that goes with things that for many people might have just been a news story that they reacted to, but then moved on within a few days or something like that, and to understand the long-term consequences for everyone involved in the story directly and indirectly. I think that's a really important thing to get out there.
I agree.
So can we go back to the beginning of your story? Can you tell me a little bit about the early years of your relationship and your marriage to Brian?
Absolutely. So when Brian and I met, we actually were both living in a ski town in California, up in the Eastern High Sierra. And a lot of people are aware of it because the Pacific Crest Trail runs right through its backyard. We lived in Mammoth Lakes and knew each other for about a year. We met at church and got married, did a lot of backpacking. That's kind of how we got to know each other. And before we knew it, we were married and starting to have babies and began to move around a little bit because it was way too expensive up there. Brian actually played online poker for a living when I met him, which was pretty funny. Wasn't very well received at church necessarily, but yeah, he was definitely a character. So we had fun with that. But eventually, when Obama came into office, the laws as far as banking regulations and online poker sites began to change. And so we were put in a position where we knew he wouldn't be able to keep his money on those sites. You'd have to keep them in offshore accounts, and it just became risky.
Mm,
So at that time, it was 2008, and we had, I think Isaac must have been, gosh, it may be a year, and he was our youngest, and Ezekiel, our oldest, was maybe a year, maybe 2 years old. And then the housing bubble burst and kind of had the recession. So everything kind of collapsed at once, and we were left wondering, what do we do? And so Brian decided to join the army.
hmm. Okay, you're already a family at that point. He wasn't a teenager joining like so many people. So that must have been an enormous transition for your family then. What was it like as a military family?
Yeah, it was a huge transition. Brian had actually come from a military family. His dad was in the Marines. So for Brian, it wasn't as big of a transition. For me, I'd grown up pretty much as far from the military as a person could. So it was a whole learning curve for me. And at that point, I want to say I was 31 when he joined. And Brian was a few years younger than me. So he was 27. And so for me, it was this huge learning curve. So going on base, it was a whole different world, you know. And of course, I love to learn, oh, a lot of these things have no tax. And, there's just as much as you have off base. But I was never fully comfortable living on base because I just wasn't used to it. So we would live off base, but I slowly learned how to shop on base and all of that.
Hmm. So how did the army treat your family then? I'm assuming that he was like away for training and that sort of thing quite a bit and kind of leaving you to figure a lot of stuff out. I mean, did you feel like the army took care of families like they should?
In that, well, it was interesting. I grew close with a couple other military wives. At that point, Brian was really only in the regular army for about a year and a half before he went out to go to Special Forces selection because he wanted to become a Green Beret. So I started getting to know some of the military wives, and so we would kind of stick together. And so, yeah, we would take care of our own. But it was interesting because the way Brian went in, because he wanted to enlist, we still didn't quite fit because I had a degree and I was older. And most of the people who were in Brian's position, they were quite a bit younger. None of them had degrees, but Brian was interested in enlisting and then going into the Green Berets and serving as one of the enlisted Green Berets. He didn't want to be an officer. His dad
Hmm.
had been an officer and he wanted a different experience.
Okay. Yeah, I guess you felt like a little bit of an outsider in those terms, like with your peers in among his unit and his peers in the unit as well.
I did. A lot of times when I remember one particular party, we would go and we would be interacting with all of the soldiers would be there, both male and female soldiers, and then, all the spouses. And a lot of times I would find I would have more in common with the soldiers, the different female soldiers who
Mm,
both working and had degrees despite being a stay-at-home mom with kids because it just I don't know. I think because they had been, a lot of the military officers had been to college, or some of the military women were beginning to go to college. And so I'd kind of had that background.
okay. Yeah, I see. I see. That makes sense. Honestly, with the age difference, I suppose, and the life experience difference that you would have with a lot of other people in that position. So Brian, he made it through selection. Obviously, I'm sure that was a really long process. How did things change for you all once he actually became a Green Beret?
Yeah. So gosh, that was a long process. He went to the SFAS, and then I think that was a couple of months away. Then we pretty much within a few months moved to North Carolina. So we had this big move from Colorado, and then we were only there for a year and a half, and then went straight to North Carolina, and we're at Bragg. And then he was in the Q course, and pretty much here barely home during the course. And that took about 3 years for him to get through the course because he had one of the hardest languages, which was modern standard Arabic.
Oh
And
no.
then he was also a medic. So being an 18 Delta medical sergeant meant that he had, I believe it was an extra 6 months longer than the other MOS training.
Hmm.
And so because they do full, like, hospital rotations and
Okay.
work
Yeah.
on emergency vehicles, they learn everything from how to deliver large animals, so they do, like, large animal veterinary rounds, they do how to deliver babies. Brian worked in burn units, I mean, anything you
My
could
gosh.
imagine, worked on
Hmm.
gunshot victims. So their main goal is to be able to go into a village and provide everything a village needs, and that way it ingratiates them to the locals.
Sure. Sure.
So, yeah, so by the time he finished, he graduated, I want to say April 2015, and within a month or two, he deployed to Afghanistan.
Hmm. Okay. So
Yeah.
he's just gone and gone and gone all the time, it sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah, what I figured out was, I think on average, even when he was home, so even when he was doing these 6-month deployments, which started after that, and he was supposedly home for 6 months, the reality was with the training schedule and everything, I really only got about 3 months a year with him.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, those were different times then with people deploying all over the world all the time, it seems like. Would both of you, all four of you, did you kind of take to it? I mean, were you making it work, or was it really stressing all of you out with the giant life changes?
No, we really made it work. It was nice because I think I was so busy. Our oldest was on the autism spectrum, or I should say, is on the autism spectrum. And so I was so wrapped up in everything autism and trying to support him and getting him the help at school. I mean, really, you're in like a battle constantly. If you have a special needs kid or a kid on the spectrum and you're trying to get them all the supports and help they need through the school. And so that took up so much of my time that I never felt like I had any downtime. And so
Mm,
it was more like a partnership. He would go do his job, and then I would do my job, which was the kids and supporting Zeke. And then when, we'd get together as often as we could, but we were always just really good friends, best friends. So when we were together, we'd take as much advantage of it as we could. So when he's deployed, I would say, okay, I'm going to plan these trips for when you're home. And then we'd save money and, take the kids to DC when he got home, or
mm.
take them on a cruise. And so we'd make the most out of the time we did have.
Okay, that's wonderful. It sounds like you were able to keep it together in a way that a lot of families have not. I know that there's some incredible struggles for military families with the constant deployments and everything like that. So you mentioned Afghanistan, but after that, it seems like you spent a great deal of time in Africa over the last couple of years, right?
Yes. So he went to Afghanistan and he came home in October of that year. Or no, it would have been November. We had the winter, and then I think he was home for Christmas. January 1st, he left for Ranger School. And he was gone to Ranger School for 3 months, got his Ranger tab on April 1st. And then he was automatically brought on to ODA 3212 right after getting back from Ranger School, and they were set to deploy May 15th. So he left a little over a month after returning from Ranger School. So I saw
Hmm.
him for 2 months, and then, he went to Ranger School, and then a month, and he was gone. So he was gone for 6 months I believe they were in Maradi, Niger that time, which is the southern part of Niger, closer to the Nigeria border. But there wasn't much activity where they were at. So he came home in October again, October 31st. And then they flew out again the following August. And that time they went to Wallam.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. I think I remember that name from the book. So is this trip to Owalam, was this the last time that you saw him?
Yes, the last time I saw him, I believe, was August 26th, 2017.
Okay. And I mean, it was a normal send off. Like, was it at the airport or something like that? I mean, can you tell us about it?
Yeah, the Green Berets, they deploy a little differently. This one, they were just flying out of the regional airport. They weren't leaving out of, the airstrip on base. So I took him down to just Fayetteville Regional Airport and dropped him off and said goodbye. This time it did feel different to me. I'd never had any issues where I felt nervous or concerned that, I just never had nerves over him going anywhere. So the only difference this time was that I had some sort of like premonition or anxiety when I dropped him off. And it was the first time I really had a problem just letting him leave.
Hmm. Okay. Were the boys with you then as well?
They were.
Okay.
Yeah, they were in the back of the car.
So was this going to be a 6-month deployment as well?
It was. Yes. So they would be flying into Niamey, and then they'd be transferred over to Wallam. And usually there would be about a week in between where I might not hear from him between. That's about how long it took them to get from, you know, the US to where they would be
Hmm.
based out of.
Okay. Yeah, and I know that this is not like he was deploying to some huge base full of Americans with amenities and all that. So was it difficult for you to communicate in the areas that he was working in?
Yes, extremely difficult. So we always struggled with him trying different SIM cards, things like that. So there were constant communication issues. We definitely didn't have FaceTime, definitely didn't. Email was a little bit, we could email a little bit and maybe talk once a week if we were doing if we were doing well.
Hmm.
So the boys didn't really talk to him much while he was gone because a lot of times too with the time differences, they'd be in bed already or whatever. So
Okay. Was he able to fill you in very much on his work, or was it just like mostly asking about you and the kids or something like that?
yeah, mostly he would ask about me and the kids. Every once in a while, he'd tell me a few things like, "Oh, we're doing missions. I'm not excited about this," or "We'll be going into Niamey this week, and I'll give you a call while I'm there." For the most part, he'd tell me, "This is a safe area. Don't worry about it." But of course, he'd say that even if it wasn't safe. So that's.
Right, right, definitely. I mean, did you on your own, were you trying to like follow the news from that region or anything like that, or just kind of relying on him?
I just relied on him. I tried not to follow the news too much because as news does, it'll just make you more concerned than you really
Yeah,
need
yeah,
to
yeah.
be. Yeah.
I understand. So, how did you learn about his passing?
Ironically, I'd had, especially that day, just, I don't know, I'd had a really bad feeling that day. It kind of had been building since he left, but that particular day, I just had this horrible feeling. And I'd been trying to avoid his mom, talking to his mom, because until I heard from him, I didn't want to talk to her because I knew I would say something like, I'm concerned. And I didn't want to scare her. So I just put the kids to bed and my phone rang and it was actually my mother in law. And she called and said, "Oh, hey, I was just calling because I had a news flash come across my phone. And I was wondering if you saw that." And I said, "No, I hadn't." And she said, "There's a team of Green Berets that was attacked up near the Mali Niger border." And my first response was, that was Brian's team. Brian's dead.
Mhm. Hmm.
And of course, I felt horrible that I just said it. So then I kind of tried to backtrack on that. But
Oh, you said it out loud to her
I
on
did.
the phone? Oh my
I
gosh.
did.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
I can understand that reaction. I mean, what what could you do or what did you do? Do you have to wait for some sort of official word? Or are you able to learn anything more on your own at that point?
You're supposed to wait for official word, but you can also, there's different numbers you can call. What I learned is that they still won't give you any information. No matter
Mm,
what, they will never tell you anything. Even if it was your spouse, they will wait until someone comes to your door in uniform and knocks. So what I did is first thing I did is I contacted headquarters and up on base and tried to get somebody with an USASOC to give me an answer. And they basically just read from a form that said they couldn't answer, essentially, which made me more nervous. And then I contacted the team sergeant, and if I think I called the team sergeant's wife, and she said she had heard from her husband, and he said that something went really bad, but that he hadn't said anything beyond that. He had just said they were up there, things went
Mm.
really bad, and that he would contact her later. So knowing that she had heard from her husband and I hadn't heard from Brian, that pretty much confirmed what I thought.
Yeah, yeah. Did you did you feel a sense of certainty or like a sense of doubt at that point? Like were you accepting already that without notification, were you already accepting what had happened?
Yes, I had been looking for uniformed officers to walk across my lawn for days. And so after my mother-in-law's call, I had already decided that I knew what happened. At that point, I was just waiting to hear the
Oh,
car pull up.
okay. How long did it take for them to actually come and notify you?
I think about an hour and a half, 2 hours. They showed up
Okay.
around 9:30, 10 o'clock at night.
Oh gosh. Okay. And was it just you? I mean, the boys weren't awake at that time, or they didn't learn at that time, I guess?
No, during all of this, when all of this was going on, all the phone calls and whatnot, I was in another room with the doors closed so they wouldn't hear me.
Okay.
So when we were notified, I let them stay asleep. They were just 9 and 11 at the time, and I needed to know how I was going to respond and be able to handle them before I could tell them.
My gosh. Yeah, that's okay. I'm sure that took a lot of strength.
Yeah, it was scary.
I bet. So they came in and notified you, and I understand that they kind of assigned someone to help with all of the ensuing details and everything like that. Did how how long did this process last? Like, I assume that your next few days were very busy and very difficult, to say the least, right?
Yes. So right after the notification, they actually wait for one person to come over. So I had to call a friend to come over because I had nobody in state that was family.
Hmm.
So I called family and then my friend came over. Then the uniformed officers left me there with her until family could get there. And then my first family member made it around 2 in the morning.
Hmm.
And then I think I didn't see the CAO, the Casualty Assistance Officer, which is who they assign to kind of help guide you through the whole process. I didn't meet him until around 5 o'clock the next night. Took him a little while to get everything put together and come over. We were supposed to go to Dover, but I got a call the next day. I had decided to send the kids to school the next morning, and that would give some time to pass so that I could have their grandpa show up and some other family members be there so that when I told them they would have extra support and I
Mhm.
would have extra support. And I wanted them to have just one more good day and not be at the house with all of this going on because I knew what their lives would look like, after that.
Yeah, those poor kids. I know it must have upended everything for them. I honestly, Michelle, I kind of teared up reading the part in the book where you did tell them at the playground afterwards. That was, I can't imagine living through that. It was tough enough just for me to read it, years after the fact, just what it was like for you and for them.
Yeah, that was definitely the worst moment of my life. It's funny, you always think that it would be that moment when you hear that someone you love died, but it's not. When there's kids involved, it's that because the minute you tell them, you take away their innocence.
Hmm.
It's like, after that, Santa Claus and all these things weren't real anymore because I mean,
Yeah,
if your dad can die, I mean, you grow up fast. And
yeah, I
so
hadn't considered that. That makes sense. My
yeah,
gosh.
so that moment was horrible. I asked my father-in-law, which I felt horrible asking him to do it, but I had no one else.
Hmm.
And I didn't want him to have to be the one to tell my kids that his son had died, but I needed him to be there with me so that, the boys would have him and know that they still had somebody to help them grow up. And so that was kind of the idea behind it and to not do it at home. So we went into the woods. There's a playground way out in the woods in North Carolina in the middle of nowhere, and we took them out there and told them.
Well, it's yeah. From my read of it, I mean, I think that you certainly handled it as good as you possibly could, and I hope that that's the way that you feel and that they feel now with the perspective of the last few years, anyway.
Yeah, I looking back, I know I feel that way. I haven't asked them. I think I try to hope that maybe they just have forgotten about that
Hmm.
because it was such a horrible moment, but I'm sure they haven't.
Yeah, yeah, I can imagine. So while you're dealing with the situation at the level of your family, of course, is this story is it also blowing up in the news at the time? Is it being talked about right at the same time, or did that come later?
Yeah, it began to blow up in the news. It was the largest loss of American life on the continent of Africa since the Battle of Mogadishu, also known as Black Hawk Down.
Hmm.
So, and it was Green Berets, special operators. So it began to break out all across the news. And there was one guy missing. He went missing for 2 days. So that just blew up with, was he taken by the ISIS militants? What might have happened to him? What does this look like? Is this a hostage situation, which is just awful? Or is he just dead and we can't find his body?
Right, right.
So,
Yeah, yeah. A lot of speculation there, and very little in the way of the facts in the first couple of days. There seems like. So I
exactly.
understand that you eventually received a call from the president, right?
I did. Yeah. I think that may have been, gosh, about 3 weeks, 2 weeks into
Mm,
this whole thing. Yeah. So we'd actually missed Dover because of my choice to tell the kids rather than hurry up to Dover with them. So most people had met him there and then, whatever. So we were waiting for a phone call. We did receive a phone call at that time from President Trump. He was, very kind, spoke to both kids. My son, who's on the autism spectrum at the time, was obsessed with Trump memes and everything Trump. So he was very excited. It kind of was a little bright spot in his day
mhm,
or his life
mm,
at that time, considering everything going on. It,
mhm.
got his mind off of it. So he was excited to talk to Trump. And they still talk all the time about how Trump told them to take care of me. And
Oh,
so
did he?
that's
Oh, wow.
he did.
That's great. That's great. And I think eventually you were able to stay at the his hotel or something. Isn't that something that you discussed on the phone?
It is. Yeah, it's funny because in the aftermath of loss, everybody, and we all do it, if there's ever anything I can do for you. So everybody says that. And of course, you always say, oh, okay, and you let it go. But when a president says that to you, I mean, it's a good opportunity to say, yes, I have a list. So Trump said, if there's ever anything I can do for you. And I said, well, actually, we'll be burying Brian up in Arlington on October 30th. And Ezekiel has always wanted to stay at your hotel. So if you don't mind, I would love if you could make that happen for us. And he did. He got us 2 rooms in his hotel for 2 nights while we were up there to bury Brian.
Wow. That's amazing. I guess he if anybody could make that happen on short notice, it was him, certainly.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
president.
And it was great. He said, just come. You can use anything, do anything. So, I mean, it was, you know, free breakfast in the room if we wanted it. We could use the spa, the just whatever. So it was fun.
That is nice. That is nice. So the funeral, I saw some photos from it in the book. I know that there's a tremendous amount of, I guess I would say, ceremony that goes into a funeral at Arlington. Was that also very difficult for you, or did it buoy your spirits in any way, or what exactly?
It was completely overwhelming for me. I'd never been to Arlington, and so the whole thing was just, I think it was an experience. But yeah, it was very overwhelming. Uh,
Hmm.
just to be in a place that you look at it and you realize for the first time just how much our freedom costs and what it has cost so many families across so many generations. stood there where I was now standing and, who'd gone through what I was now going through.
Hmm.
And then to see the number of people present and to have a folded flag handed to me and to my children by, I think mine was handed to me by General Milley. So you just, it's, it feels like too big of a moment for you.
Oh my gosh. Well, yeah, it's hard to imagine. I have been to the cemetery several times, and it is incredible. Just rolling hills everywhere, but they're all dotted with the crosses and the headstones and everything. Just thousands upon thousands of them, as far as you can see. Literally and proverbially, and it's really something else.
It really is. Yeah. It leaves an impression.
Hmm. Absolutely. So this is a few weeks after his death. At that point, did you have more answers? Were things becoming more clear, or was there still like a fog surrounding the entire event?
There was still a fog. I think I felt like, oh, it's clear enough for now. We'd had Colonel Moses, the third group commander, come to our home with another officer and basically gives their condolences. And we were told by Colonel Moses that, hey, they were on a routine patrol when they were ambushed. We don't know much. We'll get back to you and kind of give you more information as time goes by. But there's, at that point, AFRICOM, which is Africa Command, it's the four-star command over the continent of Africa. They had opened up an investigation. And so my family and I, we were very happy just to hear that. And we knew that it would take some time, but eventually, we would learn what exactly led to the whole ambush.
Okay, so they intended, or they told you right from the start that like you would receive a briefing, or they would share the results of that investigation with you. Is that correct? Like there'd be some transparency there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They just told us this is what we know now. We don't know much. More will become available. And that's why we opened up this investigation so that we can see which mistakes were made and go from there.
Okay. How long was it before they eventually gave you their findings, like in a face to face meeting?
It wasn't until April.
April. Oh gosh, so this is 6 months or so after. More than six
Yeah,
months. Yeah.
I
Wow.
think, what was it? I think, yeah, I want to say it was 7 even. So,
Okay.
because October 4th, and I think it was the end of April.
Okay. Okay. I see. And how did that briefing go? Like, did you walk out of there satisfied with what they provided to you?
No, I did not.
Okay. Can you tell me about it? Like, what did they initially tell you had happened exactly? I mean, and what was it about it that you found kind of unsatisfying?
I walked in and I remember me and my father in law. So, my father in law, having been a Marine officer, had been one who had done plenty of investigations during his career. And so he knew what to expect. So, beforehand, we had sat down and kind of gone over questions we had, things we wanted to ask. And when we went into the brief, we were told, you can ask anything you want. We will answer you. We will speed up. We have like a visual aid. We will speed up or we will reverse, whatever you want. This is your meeting. You're in control of it. We quickly learned that that was not the case. They would, rewind, they would speed up. But as far as them actually answering honestly, and that was a whole nother thing. And you could also feel with certain questions, especially pointed questions, they were very vague. And there was a lawyer there that would stand up, cut in, and answer for the officers at times to make sure they answered in a way that would, I don't know whether it was to protect officers, to protect the military, or to protect the investigative team, but it was clearly not to protect the families or to help
Mhm.
them learn the truth.
Okay. Okay. I see. So at that point, did you decide, like walking out of that briefing, did you feel like I need to learn more about this, or I just need to push them harder for more answers, or what exactly? Like, what was your plan at that point?
I left and I knew that there would be a media briefing the following week. And I was still just trying to think of why the brief that we had just had didn't sit well with me. It was very vague, and the officer in charge was very elusive, and so I didn't know what to make of it. I knew I wasn't satisfied, but I thought, well, as long as nobody's punished, because at that point during the brief, during our personal family brief, they had made it obvious that they blamed the captain of the team. Yet during that entire brief, it was also clear that they had no real evidence and no real justification for feeling that way. All the probing questions I asked them, so they were initially saying, well, this CONOP, concept of operations report, that this captain created, they felt was lacking and blame, and was what they were using to blame him for the ambush. The problem was that there were two other follow-on CONOPs created by other people who were pushing the team ahead, and they were excusing those. But they couldn't show me where the actual issue was with the first CONOP, and they wouldn't tell me who created the two follow-on CONOPs or even see those CONOPs.
Hmm.
So that to me was a huge red flag. And so when I left, I thought, you know what? I'm not going to get into this as long as they don't punish the captain, because clearly they're not punishing the officers who created the two follow on CONOPs. Then I'm fine. I just don't want to see the wrong people punished. Yes, I do want to see them fined, you know, basically to have real lessons learned so that this doesn't happen to another team or another family. But at this point, if they're not blaming the wrong people, then I'm also fine with that. Unfortunately, that all changed the next week when they did do their media brief. And this time it was the four-star commanding general of all of AFRICOM that briefed the press. And he did blame the team. He did blame the captain and say that there would be punishments. He made it very clear. And then he stated that while all teams on the continent were performing optimally, my husband's team was not indicative of what special operators do.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Yeah, that I can imagine that really lit a fire in you.
It did. At that point, I would say I was irate. It takes a lot to get me there. And it had taken me 7 months and insulting my dead husband and blaming him for his death.
My gosh. Incredible.
So,
So did you, or well, I should say, what did you decide to do at that point? I mean, how could you take any sort of action from your position to affect any change in this situation?
well, I knew that I hold no weight anywhere, and so I thought, well, I could go and interview, and my interview would be forgotten in an hour. So my next thought was, if I can go through and interview these guys on the team, because they had been told not to speak until after the families were briefed on everything. And I knew the media was going to come and begin asking them questions. But the media had also thrown them under the bus and blamed them for being a bunch of cowboys and said horrible things about them. And so my thought was, if I can talk to these guys first and get them to trust me, I would love to find out what the truth is. And I would love to acquit them and write a book, because that's the best thing you can do. Is the minute you write something down, it's permanent in my
Hmm.
mind. So I thought, if I can sort this out and write it down and permanently put it out there for everyone to read and see, anyone who thinks these guys are criminals or, guilty of what AFRICOM is saying, this is proof that they aren't. And if it's written down this way, then surely they can't be punished for it without
Hmm.
causing all sorts of issues.
Hmm. I see. And so this is obviously, like you said, months afterwards. So had you had much contact with the other surviving members of the team up to that point? I mean, were they recuperating from injuries, or were they moved on to other assignments or something like that? Or were you all still kind of in the same area there and easily reachable?
They were all easily reachable. There were a couple that were injured, and so they were more easily reached. But yeah, we'd stayed in contact. They'd show up. They'd support the boys. They were going through just a lot emotional. Well, some of them especially were going through a lot emotionally in the aftermath. Others physically. So yeah, they were all kind of in a recovery period, and they were all waiting for this investigation to finish because as soon as as soon as AFRICOM, the General of AFRICOM, stated that they would be held accountable, well, all of a sudden they were being told that they needed to be interviewed again by the military.
Hmm.
So now they were facing potential Article 15 sixes
Wow.
because they had gotten some JAG lawyers and spoken with them, and the JAG lawyers said, if you interview again and your story varies whatsoever, they can now say that you are not consistent in your story. And so therefore you need to be brought before, basically need to be punished under the UCMJ and be
Okay.
looked
Okay.
at.
I see.
So they all refused to speak after that. And so, or interview again, is they were recommended by their JAG lawyers to not be interviewed again unless forced to. And so they were all staying in that area at that point. They didn't know what was going to happen to them.
Hmm.
And so that's when I talked to them. I said, listen, clearly you guys are about to be punished for something you aren't at fault for. So would you be interested in interviewing with me and letting me write your story? And maybe if we get it out there, at this point, they're either going to punish you or they aren't. But if they do punish you, what do you have to lose?
Hmm. Right.
So,
Right. Right. And if I recall correctly, Michelle, at this point, hadn't they been under like a gag order during the investigation? Like they hadn't really opened up to you yet about what had happened, even though it was months earlier.
right, they've been told not to speak about it whatsoever. But the minute they realized that they hadn't been, they had been silenced, there were also leaks coming out. Probably it sounded like from other officers who were making it sound like these guys were at fault, or from people within the investigation making it sound like they were at fault.
Hmm.
So they weren't allowed to speak up for themselves, and yet they had all sorts of people saying horrible things about them, leaking to the media. So, yeah, at that point, they hadn't spoken to anybody. So,
Okay, so at that point, these interviews kind of led toward what eventually became your book, right? And I guess that you learned a tremendous amount of the kind of the minute by minute of what happened that day, right?
I did, yeah. So what I did is I took each individual guy and I sat them down one at a time and interviewed them and just let them tell me their version of the story. And what was amazing is there were multiple disparities that popped up right away from, just what I was told the enemy campsite they went up to looked like, all the way to their maneuverability, like the different things they did on the ground during the ambush and the con ops.
Hmm. Okay. So if you don't mind, I'd like to go back kind of through the day and everything that you learned about it. So can you take us back? I understand that it's called the battle at Tongo Tongo or the ambush at Tongo Tongo.
Yes. So they were ambushed outside a little village called Tongo Tongo, Niger. And so what happened was they were to leave their base in Wallam and travel north to a village called Tilawa, do a key leader engagement, do kind of like, and then look, connect with the civilians in the area, and then drive back to their place in Wallam. And the reason they got asked or tasked with this was they were asked, let me go back. There was a piece of intelligence that there was a leader of an ISIS militant group called Dondu Shefu, who was in the area shopping. And so they wanted to send the team down to see if he was in the area. If so, they would be required to call back to headquarters and call in for reinforcements because my husband's team was not the kind of team that would go after a key leader like that, a militant leader. So it was mainly to go down, make sure the civilians felt comfortable, and that get in basically gather any information they could. They knew that he probably wouldn't still be in the area because the piece of intelligence had a 2-hour time window, and it was going to take them at least an hour to pack and a couple hours to drive down there. And by the time they got there, they knew that they'd be well outside of that time window. So my husband's team kind of pushed back against it initially, and then they finally agreed and were told they had to go anyway. Then they were called back and said, "Hey, actually, what we want you guys to do is we want you to go down in the morning, not tonight," because that was at around 8 o'clock at night that they got that initial information. So they decided that they would instead go down the next morning. And so they got up early. They were joined by a reconnaissance vehicle and that came from Niamey. And they all headed out around 5 in the morning to go down to, or to go up to Tillowa. And at this point, all the intelligence that this militant would be there is so old that it's not really relevant. So the captain of the team makes a con up based off of that and says, "Hey, we're going to go down on a civ mil mission and basically just, you know, engage with the civilians, engage with this military outpost that's down there, and have like a key leader engagement, and then we'll head back home." And so that's important because all this time everything hinged, all the blame on the team and the captain hinged on that con op. They said that it wasn't a civ mill and that, they were going after a terrorist, and that basically, well, yeah, that they would, we'll just leave it at that they were going after a terrorist and they were a bunch of cowboys. But the reality is that's exactly, they were just going down to do the civ mill, and they were way outside the time window for that leader being there any longer. So they went down, they did this, and they were on their way home. As they headed back home, they actually received a call outside the village of Mengezi and were told to stop. So they stopped the convoy. It was an 8-vehicle convoy, and they were told they wanted them to turn around, that they had gotten another piece of SIGINT, so single source signals intelligence, same source. They had received another one, and this time they wanted them to turn around, head up towards the Mali border to a campsite that was just on the other side of the border, so just barely in Niger. And they believed that this was the militants' campsite, and they wanted to send my husband's team up there and basically collect intelligence.
Every day, you're under attack, whether you realize it or not. Your digital devices contain your entire life, your finances, your conversations with friends and family, your interests, and even your movements. And all of that is vulnerable to an ever expanding class of criminals, scam artists, hackers, and even governments. You don't want to leave your data security entirely in the hands of your ISP, or anyone else for that matter. It's up to you to protect yourself using a multi-layered defense strategy. Silent offers you the protection you need to keep your data and devices secure from wireless threats. Their multi-shield technology blocks cellular signals, GPS, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, EMP, RFID, NFC, and more. Silent's lineup includes everything from signal blocking wallets all the way up to 40 cubic liter Faraday duffel bags. When you're geared up with Silent, you'll be truly disconnected, undetectable, untraceable, and unhackable. And you can now use the discount code SPYCRAFT101 to save 10% off your order from Silent. Find them at slnt.com. That's slnt.com.
And the problem is that my husband's team was headed up there in vehicles that moved maybe 25 miles an hour. They would run out of roads, and they knew that there was nothing they could do as far as capture or detain anybody, because at this point, all the militants would be on motorcycles. they'd be moving around 25 miles an hour, which is at least 15 to 20 miles an hour faster than those vehicles, than my husband's team's vehicles
Mhm.
could move in that sand. So they wouldn't be able to really do anything. It would put them in a bad position. Also, they had only packed for a 1-day mission, and they would be running low on water, and the partner forces would be running low on food. They would also all be running low on sleep. So they pushed back and said, this doesn't make any sense. They kind of went back and forth with leadership for a while. Finally, they realized, well, we're going to have to do it. So our best bet is to see if we can include anybody. So Captain Perzini called his friend who was part of a heliborne unit up in Arlit, Niger. So Team Arlit had helicopters. So they could fly down and create a southern or a northern blocking position to kind of keep the militants from crossing into Mali. We have no rights as Americans. We can't, we don't have the ability to go into um, Mali at all. But the militants, it's kind of a area that they're allowed to go back and forth into. Basically, that would prevent the Nigerian militant from going over and crossing borders
Okay.
and getting away
Got
from
it.
us. So, and then on top of it, it would also have the benefit of having built in CASEVAC. So if there were any casualties, any incidents whatsoever, we would have that built in with these heliborne units. So just overall, it made a lot of sense. So Arlit said, yes, we want to be a part of this. So then that they kind of got on board. And now my husband's team would become the backup team, which was
Okay.
perfect. And so, anyway, that's kind of what happened next. So they started heading north, and Arlit then began doing video teleconferences and building their con op and working with the officers back at headquarters. So now this involves not just my husband's team and the officers back at Niamey, but it now also involves Lieutenant Colonel David Painter, who was the battalion commander at the time. And so now David Painter is saying, yes, this is how we're going to do it. And now they're also contacting Colonel Moses. They have to involve just everybody all the way up the chain. So they're all involved now in the teleconferences and making these decisions, everybody up the chain. Meanwhile, my husband's team is just driving north. So they have a point that they're supposed to get to, and they're supposed to be met by Team Arlit. And they drive the whole way through the desert. And as you can imagine, the desert at night, you're traveling maybe 5 miles an hour, you run out of roads, and it's tall grass, and they have to be very careful so that they don't hit any divots. So the team captains were walking out front, leading the vehicles. And finally, after I'd say about they must have gone up there around 11 o'clock at night. So after quite a bit of traveling, they get up there, they come to their point where they're supposed to meet Team Arlit, and then they hear over the radio that Team Arlit has run into weather, and now they've been canceled. They've been turned around.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, so they're up in the desert completely alone. And this is kind of a no man's land. There's It's known as the Wild West of Africa. It's a free fire zone. And what that means is that if there's anybody out at night, they can be shot on sight because the only people who are out at night are terrorists.
Hmm.
And if anybody's seen on a motorcycle any time of day, they can also be shot on sight because it's such an impoverished nation that the only people who can afford vehicles and gas are either military or militants.
Wow.
And so, yeah, it's not a very safe place. And so they get up there, and clearly, if you know deserts, you can hear vehicles coming from miles and miles and miles away. And this is known to be enemy territory. And they've just driven an 8 vehicle convoy up there, and now they're up there alone.
Okay.
So they now hear over the radio that they are going to be the only team and the lead team the next day, and they still have a significant amount of distance to move in order to be anywhere near the campsite. So they aren't going to actually sleep that night. They have about an hour worth of sleep that they'll get, maybe, but they still have to pull security. They still have to run missions and, or not missions, rehearsals, and they still have to make a plan for the next morning. So basically, the partner force slept, and these are a bunch of 17 and 18-year-old Nigerians who've never been in battle and certainly have never gone without sleep. And so my husband's team let them sleep while they're trying to run their rehearsals and make a plan for the next morning. And so they give everybody an hour, then wake all the guys up and just start heading north again, further into enemy territory. They run up, they run their sweep of the area. While they're sweeping the area the next morning, they actually hear a motorcycle start up from behind them. Their only asset is a drone that's running out of fuel. And so the captain makes a decision to send the drone after the motorcycle they heard start up that had two terrorists hop on it and ride off into the desert towards the Mali border. And so he thought, well, I might as well have it follow them. And that way, if, they decide to find friends and come follow us, we'll be alerted. But essentially, it followed them and saw them cross the border at one point, and then it was running out of fuel. So then he had to send it back. It was a shared UAV. So yeah, so they basically share it with other teams on the continent. So at that point, it was done, needed to get refueled and sent to another team. So now they're out there alone completely. And I would find out later that what actually happened was that motorcycle was seen meeting up with other motorcycles in the desert. Then they all split off. Then the UAV followed them across the border and then went back.
Hmm.
So my husband's team was up there. They did their sweep. They found weapons, found ammunition, motorcycles, kind of burned everything they could, then turned around and began heading home. They went into, eventually, they were, the partner force needed food and water. So they pulled off into a village called Tongo Tongo. It was the first village they ran into after leaving the campsite. And they got there, and as the partner force was eating and getting some water, they were approached by the chief of the village. And he came with a large group, and they all seemed very upset. And at first, he was in the captain's face, pointing his finger, saying, you guys never come down here, or you never come up here, you never take care of us. I've been arrested and talked to, but nobody takes care of us. And then finally, the team captain was getting pretty concerned and said, okay, well, we need to go pretty soon. And then the chief flipped and became very friendly and began offering, oh, you guys should stay for lunch. I can give you a goat. And the captain said, no, we're past our time limit. We need to leave. I'm sure everybody's had lunch and time for us to go. So he began delaying. He ran in and grabbed a sick child for Brian to inspect. So my husband, Brian, checked the kid. He had scoliosis. And so just kind of told him what to do. And basically, they're trying to get out of there. So they load up the vehicles and they begin to leave. And before they had even cleared the village, shots began to ring out.
Okay, so this is where it really went, I guess I'd say, sideways. So this all, I guess that there was this force gathering while they were in the village and after the drone had left, so they didn't really have any way of learning about it until they were engaged.
That's exactly right. And they weren't even sure right away if it was if they were being engaged or if it was accidental, if somebody was just taking, pot shots at them hoping to get lucky, because it was 8 vehicles. And in the front are the Nigerian vehicles because they lead in their own country. And then my husband's team, they had their cars in the middle, their trucks in the middle. And then the last couple of vehicles were the Nigerian vehicles. So they thought, well, maybe these guys are just getting into their car and accidentally shooting around into the ground, because that happens sometimes. So they weren't exactly sure. And then all of a sudden, the fire began to increase. and they still were just planning on driving through. And here was a big difference between what the public was told and what I learned later. We were told through the media and through the investigation and through the general of AFRICOM that the captain at that point decided to stop the truck and do a bold flanking maneuver and act like a tough guy. What actually happened were the lead Nigerian partner force vehicles, hearing the shots, panicked because they'd heard about previous incidents of ambushes in the area by militants. So they slammed on their brakes and put it in reverse and slammed into the front of the American vehicle. Then the second vehicle in front tried to go around that car crash and ended up reversing and clipping the driver's side door of the American vehicle. So now the American vehicle was hit in the front and blocked in
Hmm.
on the side. So that they essentially could go nowhere. And so it brought the entire convoy to a halt. And at that point, the teams exited the vehicle, and the captain said, "Okay, I'm going to run around, see who this is, take him out real quick. And during that time, you kind of get the vehicles adjusted and we'll get moving." Well, as he grabbed a couple guys and ran to do a bold flanking maneuver, the men on the team that were with the vehicles noticed that slowly the fire rate was increasing. So they were engaging the enemy, but then they noticed that the enemy was beginning to grow. And it hit a point where they then realized, okay, we need to get our kits on and our helmets on because this isn't just a few shots. This is now officially a firefight. And it wasn't long before the team captain went over, noticed that not only like was he taking people down, but for every few people he put down, twice as many were popping back up.
Hmm.
So he realized, okay, we now have a growing threat. And then he goes, they were clearly they knew tactics, they understood them because now they are coming around and beginning to outflank us on the road. And if it gets to that point, we're going to be trapped on the road. So the captain grabbed the guys he'd taken there and ran with them back to the vehicles and said, okay, we've got to go now. By that point, fire had increased and the firefight had become so significant that one of our mounted machine guns had already burned up.
Oh my
And
gosh.
so there was only one left.
Wow. So yeah, this was not your husband's team was not super heavily armed, obviously, for their mission in country. Only a couple of vehicle mounted machine guns, and the Nigerian partner force is obviously reacting in the worst possible way there as well. So do you have an idea? Did they have an idea by this time of just how many militants they were facing?
I don't think they did. It's interesting because when I asked, how many, it was anywhere from, it was interesting. The numbers went like, oh, there were about 80 militants to there were 150 to there were over 200. So
Hmm.
I don't know. But this was a team of 11 men, 11 Americans, and there were 30, I want to say 35 Nigerians, but most of them were 17, 18, 19, had never been in a firefight, had hardly used their weapons. And when shots rang out, they were mostly ducking, or a lot of trucks were turning and leaving the firefight. So in the end, it was just a handful of Nigerians and the team, the Green Berets.
Okay.
So when you're talking that, it was more 10-1 in the firefight.
Yeah. Yeah.
And on
Unbelievable.
top of that, I mean, the weaponry that they were coming with they were far outgunned as well, just as far as the machinery they brought. A lot of Russian era, ZPUs and other such weapons. So
Yeah. Incredible stuff. Were the vehicles? I mean, how long were they stuck in that kind of kill zone right there with the crash with the Nigerian vehicles? Were they able to extricate themselves from that?
they were, but not all the vehicles got out. So by the time Mike came back, Captain Berrezzini came back, they began to try and extricate themselves. The biggest issue is they didn't want to leave anyone behind, and a lot of the Nigerians didn't. They spoke multiple languages. The first person to run from the firefight was the translator. And in a country like Niger, there are 20 plus languages that are spoken in
Oh my
dialects.
gosh.
And so there were very few who spoke all the languages left. My husband Brian happened to have taught himself Hausa, so he could help with some of the men and get them moving and into trucks, but he didn't speak the other languages. And most of the guys on the team also spoke French. So though anyone who spoke Hausa or French, they could communicate with, but the rest of the dialects they couldn't.
Oh
So
my
it took a
gosh. Oh my gosh.
lot of trying to just get everybody to maneuver. So it took a lot longer than it should have. And then on top of it, we found out later that their radios weren't working. A lot of their radios weren't working properly. And so they thought they were radioing out, and they weren't radioing out as much as they thought, or they weren't getting through as much as they thought.
Mm, okay.
So in the end, they made the decision, let's get everybody in the trucks. We're going to throw basically a red smoke bomb and kind of try to extricate ourselves. We're going to do two 300-meter bounds. And as we do that, we'll just look and see, make sure we're all together. And then we'll do the next 300-meter bound. And that should get us up the road and away from the terrorists. And so during all of this, what ended up happening is my husband's vehicle was now the last vehicle in line. And we actually have video of what happened. There's head cam video out there of this whole incident. And there's a full 45-minute video. And in it, you hear Jeremiah asking my husband what they should do. And my husband says, we should stay. So they made the decision to stay behind in order to basically provide cover fire and get the other men out. And so they didn't discuss it with the other trucks. So when the other trucks went, they made it to the first 300-meter mark, looked back, and my husband's truck was gone. And so two men dropped from a vehicle and went back to find Brian and Dustin and Jeremiah, who were with that truck, and they never found them.
So all of the men from your husband's truck were the casualties that day?
Yes. So Brian, if in the video you see him leading the truck, and so he's out front. He's got a weapon. He's basically providing cover fire, moving the vehicle forward. And Dustin is driving the truck, and Jeremiah is providing fire at the back end of the truck. And so they continue firing as the trucks move out. And then once the trucks move out, they begin maneuvering to try and get out as well. At one point, the back window is shot out and shatters, and the glass hits Jeremiah and he falls. And Brian, thinking he was hit, basically sprinted out, exposing himself to incoming fire, and he was hit and killed. And so when he was hit, at that point, Jeremiah had gotten up and ran out, and he grabbed Brian and called over Dustin, and him and Dustin drug him back. And by then, the entire focus of the enemy was my husband's truck. And so they were surrounding Dustin and Jeremiah. And Jeremiah and Dustin were forced to, and Brian was already dead at that point, were forced to retreat into the desert and were basically chased down and killed.
Oh my gosh. Okay. And I know that you mentioned the fourth member of the team who was missing for a while. That was not Jeremiah or Dustin that was missing?
No. So then so they did their 300-meter bounds, and they were making a stand there. And once Brian, Dustin, and Jeremiah had been killed, the enemy began to circle around and come at the rest of the team from another angle. So while they were there was a quiet period, and then once again, it just began to turn into absolute mayhem. And so as that happened, they could tell they were about to be overrun very soon. And so they made the decision to turn their vehicles back. There was a wooded, marshy area, and they just said, that's our best hope. Let's turn these vehicles around and head back towards the woods and see if we can just make a run through the woods. And so they ordered everyone into their vehicles. LaDavid was driving one vehicle, and I was told you always stay with the vehicle you're driving. And the way the stands were for the mounted machine guns, it prevented them from looking out their rear window. So basically, it was just run to your car, get in, and drive. And so everybody ran to a car, dove in, and drove. And at one point, the everyone in the back of the truck started yelling that the captain had been thrown from the truck. And so the driver of truck one turned around, and when he turned around, he realized not only had he lost the captain, but he had lost the other truck, which was the David's truck.
Oh my gosh.
So he never really knew what happened, if LaDavid made it to his truck, if he didn't. So what he was hoping was that LaDavid had made it to his truck, but had taken off a different direction. And what they would find out later was that he hadn't. He had actually instead had to run from the truck and had run uphill and taken cover under a tree and was killed there.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, LaDavid, he was with the team, but he had not been through the qualification course or anything. He was like a mechanic assigned as a supporting troop to the team. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes, he was the team mechanic. He was actually with them a second year. They had requested that he return with them because he was so well liked, and he was actually studying. He had just increased his ASVAB score so he could go through the Q course. He wanted to go to SFAS that following summer after returning from Niger. So the whole team was working with him to try and get him to someday be a part of the team.
Wow. Wow, that's wonderful. I know he had a great reputation with them, like you said. And the pictures I've seen, honestly, he looks so young. I don't know if he just had like boyish looks or something, but he looked 5 or 10 years younger than all the other guys on the team, was my impression of him, honestly.
Yeah, he was. He was 25.
25. Okay. Yeah. He honestly looked even younger than that to me, but it sounds like
Yeah.
I mean, it's awful what happened to him, but it sounds like he really like acquitted himself really well that day. Like he was a natural at what he did.
Yeah, he was. He was really an incredible guy.
So things have fallen apart in a big way at this point. Obviously, I guess there's two American trucks that are lost, and the Nigerian soldiers are scattered all over the place. I mean, how does the team kind of rally? And Captain Perazini, I believe he'd already been shot in the back, if I remember correctly, and fallen out of the truck at that point. So he's in pretty bad shape, it sounds like. How
Yeah,
did they kind of rally at that point?
so they threw him back in the truck and just begin. Basically, they gunned the truck back towards where they were headed initially, which back into the woods. And they were hoping to just drive it through this big marsh, and instead it got stuck in the mud. So then everybody was forced out of the vehicle. They had to zero out the radios. And at that point, unable to come up with another word, the communications sergeant basically just yelled broken arrow and zeroed out the radios. And then they were forced to retreat into the woods. And by that point, they were having mortar rounds come in after them. They were being shot at by every weapon you can imagine. So yeah, they said they just remember running through the woods and, trees lighting up next to them. And they knew that at that point they needed a miracle. They needed basically American, planes to come in and scare these guys off, or drop bombs or something. But their only hope was to hide at that point. They had several injured. Pretty much everyone in their truck except two men had been injured in some way, been shot. So, like, the communications sergeant had been shot through the elbow, and they were afraid he was going to bleed out. They had just put a tourniquet on him. The captain had been shot through the back. Another guy had been shot through the Achilles. So these guys were just falling apart. And so they ran through the woods towards the outside. They knew they couldn't go back to the village because they had actually seen some of the villagers during the firefight shooting at them.
Oh wow.
So they were sure that no matter what, the village was not a good place to go back to. They knew they at least had a few enemies there. And so basically, they just went and found a low spot where they could hide really well and camouflage themselves into the surrounding brush. and hope that they weren't spotted.
Man, what a horribly desperate situation. I mean, I can read this and I can hear it from you, but I can't imagine being there and feeling like no help is coming, and the majority of the team is either killed or injured already, and it doesn't look like you're going to live out the next few minutes. Probably would be their perspective.
Yeah. No, I honestly, even telling it myself, it reminds me of each different man as I sat down and they told me this spot, this piece right here, and just the looks on their faces and how you could just feel the desperation as they told me, what they were going through, what they remember from those moments. And it's just, writing texts to their loved ones, praying that they don't see them on, the television captured, because that's the only thing worse than being captured, yeah, or being killed by a terrorist is being captured by one. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
just them telling me just the things they were going through and how it affected them still in that moment 7 months later, it changed my whole perspective on our military members, and especially on those who go through something like this and have to come back home and adjust and face family members like me.
Hmm. Yeah, unbelievable stuff. So, how did they survive in the end? The remaining members of the team.
So they basically holed up there, and I guess they had been trying to communicate for a while, and they were laying out there for quite a bit. They could hear people walking by looking for them. At one point, they were laying there, and there were three men who were set up basically with their guns set as like a perimeter, keeping lookout for anybody who came up, and they were protecting the casualties. And they happened to be some of the youngest and most inexperienced guys who were left, watching over everybody. And at one point, the terrorists walked right up to them, stopped, looked down, and made eye contact with them. And right at that moment, a bunch of fast moving jets flew overhead, and it dispersed everybody.
My gosh,
So that's
unbelievable.
pretty much what happened that saved them.
Okay, these
And
were they French jets, if I recall correctly?
yes, it was the French. It was the French. So they came over from, I believe, was it Gao? Yeah, I believe so. But yeah,
Incredible. So, were they were ultimately picked up by French reinforcements?
they were. So the next couple hours were kind of a mess because, like I'd said, the communications weren't working. It turns out that they had sent in another UAV overhead for communication, but the problem was that the drone was manned by someone back in the U.S., and so communications turned into an absolute nightmare. And so the communications were going to a guy in the States. Then the guy in the States was having to contact the leadership in Niamey. And then the leadership in Niamey was having to send messages back to the States to go back down to the ground. So it
Wow.
just went in circles. And so they kept thinking they'd picked him up, and it turns out they'd picked up somebody else, or, so it took, I think it was almost 5 hours before the men finally were rescued off the ground. And by that point, the man who'd been shot through the elbow, Sergeant Staff Sergeant Bartels, he had nearly bled out, and they were having to slap him awake and push on his sternum just to keep him awake. His heart rate was down to 40 beats per minute.
Ah,
And then they were forced to leave their hiding spot because the French refused to land unless they could see the Americans. So finally, they left their hiding spot, and right as they came out, a vehicle drove up with the chief from the village, and he pointed at the team, and the vehicle opened fire on the team. And so the team dropped, And by then they only had, I think, one magazine left, and they emptied the magazine and then dropped to the ground. And they were continuing to be fired upon by this vehicle. And finally, one of their partner forces who had been with them the whole time stood up and began yelling "friends" in French and waving his hands wildly. And for some reason, that caused the vehicle to stop firing.
So it was
And
a
it was only,
friendly fire incident then.
it was, yes, it
Wow.
was.
Wow, that could have been the end for all of them.
Yeah. And so at that point, the aircraft finally landed and came and picked up the men and took them back.
Okay. My gosh, what an event that was. It's really hard to put it into words. I can't imagine what those guys went through. And then it wasn't long after that, or maybe even simultaneously, that the word was coming back to the States about what happened, I guess.
Yeah.
Since you mentioned La David was missing, how did they eventually find him? Was it the French that had to go out and recover him, or Nigerian partner force, or American QRF?
So there was America has this whole, and I'm probably not going to say it right, but one of the guys explained it to me for the book so I could write it properly. But we have this whole rescue thing that we set up where all these reinforcements come in. I think he said there were hundreds of people looking for La David over the course of the next several days. And ironically, it wasn't actually them who found La David. There were a couple of kids from the village out playing and happened upon his remains under the tree. And then they contacted the military, and then the military came out and picked him up. So, yeah, it was actually American birds who came in and picked up the remains, identified him, and picked up his remains.
That's good that they were able to get him back. That's really good.
Yeah.
So we already have discussed, what happened stateside after that and with the investigations, but what happened after you gathered all of this information? Did you have additional contact with the senior members of the chain of command, with AFRICOM and with USASOC, like you mentioned, or were they kind of hands off after that first briefing with you?
They were hands off after that first briefing. I was told that I would be given a final redacted report after they basically spent some time doing redactions. And that took another year before I would receive an actual redacted report. So what I ended up doing is I collected my interviews probably in, gosh, let's see, it must have been May of 2018 is when I collected them. And then I also talked to Major Alan Van's son, who lost his job over the incident, and the former SOC Africa commander, General Don Bulldog. And then I also spoke to some people who were working at the AOB at the time. So over the course of the next year, I kind of collected all of this and I just began writing. Eventually, I got my first article published. And after I had my first article published, then I was able to find an agent who was willing to work with me. And so once I had an agent, I began to work on a book proposal. And my goal was to have a publisher by exactly 2 years to the date after Brian's death. And I did accomplish that. I was in a meeting with Putnam by October 2019.
Gosh. Yeah, sounds like you were relentless in pursuing this story to its end, certainly.
I was. I don't think it's ever okay for the military to lie to families of the fallen. I'm fine with signing off on never telling anybody else the things they tell me, but I'm not okay with them lying to me and punishing the wrong people.
Yeah, very, very understandable. So what did happen to Captain Perezzini? You said that they were trying to lay the blame on him. Is that ultimately what happened in the official sense?
Yes, they issued him a letter of reprimand. And then my father in law and I and several other people basically wrote letters saying that we support him and all the reasons why we felt that the letter of reprimand was unacceptable. And so the letter was rescinded. Then he was once again handed a letter of reprimand during a second round of punishments. and he again had that one rescinded.
Hmm. Okay. So, I guess now there's nothing specifically derogatory in his record, but nevertheless, I guess people know what happened. Like his name has been associated with the failures of that mission, like publicly, right?
Oh, yeah. So many people will say to me, I will tell them, like, I wrote this book. I am the widow of one of the men. I don't blame him. And they will tell me, I was an officer. I'm a Green Beret. I know what happened. And I know all about that story and the captain. And he's just terrible. So, because, it's once it's out there, people just, they don't search further and they think the truth is what they've been told already.
Yep. Yep. So what has he and the other members of the team done since then? Have they remained in the military by and large, or have they had to move on any way they can?
Not all of them have remained in, but most of them have. There's only been one that's gotten out. There's one who just recently retired, but most of them had stayed in. Captain Pericini has actually been promoted. It took a long time. It took his promotion took a lot longer than it should have, and it took a lot of people getting involved and fighting on his behalf to get it to actually go
Hmm.
through. But he did get his promotion, and hopefully he will continue to get promoted because he's a great leader and just a really good guy in general. So my husband didn't trust many people. Green Berets have a certain way of being pretty, what would you say, pretty critical of leadership.
Hmm.
And so if they like a leader, that says a lot about that leader. And Brian was no exception. He was very critical of leadership, but he had a lot of good things to say about Mike.
Oh wow.
So
Well, that really stands out on its own merits than his recommendation and his belief in Perazini.
yeah.
You mentioned, was it Van Sant? I think you said also was punished. What was his role exactly?
He was. So Alan Van San, and this is interesting. So Major Alan Van San was the company commander. He was in Niamey that year as the company commander, but he had actually left on paternity leave just before the incident. So he was out of country when it happened. He was the first person to show up at my house and just, give me pay his respects. And you could tell he was so torn up over what happened. Ironically, they blamed him for lack of pre deployment training for the team. But once I looked into it and once I interviewed him, I learned that pre deployment training, not only was he not there during the pre deployment training, it was not his job to both resource it or validate it. So he had nothing to do with any of the training or the signing off on the training. Validation is a very specific term in the military, and according to the Army's own handbook, only an officer 2 levels up can do the actual validation and the resourcing for the company, and that is the battalion commander. And then before they deploy, the group commander, 3 levels up, has to sign off on the training for everybody in the group that's leaving. So this validation would have had to happen by Lieutenant Colonel Painter, who ironically is also the one who ordered the guys ahead twice after they pushed back on the mission
Hmm.
once Team Arlit was turned around. And then also Colonel Moses, who was part of the decision making process. And also, just to throw this in there, Colonel Moses was the one who showed up to my house to tell me in the early days that they knew nothing about what happened and that the men were just on a routine patrol.
Oh wow. And he had been instrumental in the whole thing then.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. That's not good. Well,
No.
so
So
Michelle, what do you feel like after all of this? What do you feel like are the lessons that have been learned or should have been learned from this incident? Like, have they been learned at all?
I really don't think so. I think the men over there need better vehicles. I think that obviously sharing assets in a country that large is never a good thing. To have an unmanned drone and only have one for the entire continent is that's not acceptable. Surely we can afford to put a couple more over on the continent.
Yeah, I thought we had
Um,
a lot of those things.
Yeah, exactly. So, just the assets in general, when we've got our men on the ground, need to reflect the value of the men we have on the ground,
Hmm.
and unfortunately, that's not what we're doing. We're more concerned about, saving money on assets than saving the men's lives,
Yeah,
unfortunately, is what it looks like.
that is unfortunate.
Um, so that, and, we also need to make sure that when the men on the ground are saying this is not okay, there's something wrong here, that we listen to the men on the ground, that they can't just be overridden if they sense something is wrong and if our partner forces are telling us something is wrong.
Hmm.
So
Yeah. It sounds like they were just, like you said, overrode again and again throughout the 48 hours or so leading up to the actual ambush.
they were. Yeah. And if you read the book, you see throughout, because I document each time they pushed back and each time they were overridden.
Yes.
And it reached a point where other officers were saying they should be turned around, they should go home, they should not go through with this. And still, those highest up the chain said, no,
Hmm.
we're sending them anyway.
Yep. So, Michelle, how have you and your sons been over the past few years? I mean, we talked about the immediate aftermath, and I know that in one sense, or I have to assume that in one sense, you can't exactly move on from this, but you have to move forward, right? So, are they doing okay? Are you doing okay overall, you think?
We are, it's a process, especially when you're talking about a situation that's complicated where, I always say, oh, I wish he would have just died like normal people die if he was going to die, because
Hmm.
we could we could grieve and we could have some quiet, and we could move forward a little bit easier. But we're talking about videos on YouTube of their dad's death,
Yeah.
and people making comments, and just, and now they're teenagers and they're finally opening up to me and talking about that, and how hard that is, and how hard it is to deal with the anger that comes with that. And so we're doing well, all things considered. I do, as far as support from the military, they do a great job financially supporting us. But I think the biggest lack that I see is in, like, emotional support in the aftermath. So getting any sort of therapy is next to impossible.
Hmm.
So I'm just now finally figuring out the avenues, and it's a constant push to try and get my kids into therapy. And it's been years of trying to just, you know, get them any help or
Hmm.
get me any help. It's almost impossible.
Wow, I would not have expected that, honestly. But I mean, the bureaucracy likes to throw obstacles in the way of even the simplest things. I do know that much.
Yeah, I mean, they lump us with the veterans as far as healthcare and mental health care. And if you can imagine being in line with a veteran who's been to war and how much guilt that brings to the widows, we're not okay with it. And there are already long, long lines just for them trying to get what they need. So you feel guilty taking anything away from them, and it
Hmm.
doesn't feel right. So it's, yeah, if it's hard for the veterans to get help, it's also equally, if not harder, for the widows and the kids to get help.
My gosh, yeah, I hadn't really considered that until now, but that does make a lot of sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, we talk about it all the time. I have a group of widows that I have become close with, and it's known that if you want to get mental health support, you have to go in and say, "I'm going to kill myself
Oh
today
my gosh.
if I don't get help."
Oh my gosh. That's terrible.
So, yeah.
Jeez. So, Michelle, what are you doing these days? I mean, are you still doing more writing, or are you now? I mean, the book has been out for a while now, so are you publishing more articles or anything else related to this, to the Tonga Tonga situation at all?
I do podcasts here and there. I do some writing. A lot of my writing is a mix of writing about this incident, but a lot of times I just write about military, grief, just other things like that, experiencing just going to Arlington, and I do a lot of speaking engagements, particularly around, Memorial Day and Flag
Oh, sure.
Day and all of those types of things, Veterans Day. But and then a lot of times I'll just go and tell my story at different events, veterans events, and in my local area. But beyond that, I'm also working on starting a nonprofit right now. So that's been a big area of focus the
Oh,
last
okay.
year.
Can you tell me about it now, or are you keeping it under wraps at the moment?
Well, I'll tell you a little bit about it.
Sure.
So, we kind of want to do two pieces, and we're trying to figure out how this will work. We want to work on some advocacy. So, we want to advocate for change in military and policies. And that way, obviously, one of our first ones that we're interested in working on is changing the way military investigations are done so that basically a command cannot investigate themselves the way AFRICOM investigated itself.
Hmm.
And so when an incident occurs, it hopefully we can change the law so that it has to be taken outside of that command for an investigation.
Okay. Yeah, that
Um,
certainly seems sensible.
yeah. And so that's one thing we're interested in doing. The other thing is we want to do a few programs just to support children and widows of the fallen. One of those things that we want to focus on is mental health care. And another thing we want to focus in on is just things that will financially alleviate some of the stress. So maybe we're talking about the what's called a drive program where we help teenagers get their license by covering all the costs
Hmm.
associated with driver's training and all of that.
Okay. Okay. Terrific. Good deal. So, Michelle, is there anywhere that people can connect with you online after they hear this if they want to learn more or follow your nonprofit? Do you have a public media or a social media presence, anything like that?
I do, absolutely. If you want to go to Instagram, I'm on Instagram at Michelle Black 71. Same with Twitter, Michelle Black 71. Or if you're on Facebook, I'm at author Michelle Black.
Okay. Okay. Fantastic. Yeah, we'll put those in the show notes and then I'll mention it on Instagram when this episode comes out as well.
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you, Michelle. This is quite a story and it's really something, my heart goes out to you and your family for all that you've been through, but it sounds like you've really shined a light on this incident that they probably did not want to have a light shined on to begin with. So, congratulations to you for all your hard work because it's really getting the story of Brian and Jeremiah and LaDavid and everybody else out there for the public, which I think is something that is really important to do.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on and, anything I can do to bring light to it. And also, for me, a big motivation when I wrote the story too was just to have these men who'd already been through so much acquitted of all wrong because they really didn't deserve not only what happened to them, but more than anything, the lack of support and coming back home and having just the whole world be against them for a while.
Yeah, yeah. My gosh, that is such a tough thing for me to imagine them having to deal with when people are looking at them. You fight a battle and you suffer losses as they did, and then everybody says that it's your fault that it happened in the first place. That's really incredible, and it's uncalled for, and it's almost unheard of, really, as well. So I can't imagine the stress and the strain that they must have all been under.
Oh yeah, it was insane, and to watch it firsthand was just heartbreaking.
Hmm.
And I'd been close to them before they left, so I knew better. But a lot of families came in and they heard what the news was saying, and they also thought that these guys were at fault what happened to their kids. And I just went, oh my gosh, this is so heartbreaking
Yeah,
because I
absolutely.
can't fix it, but I know that it's not true.
Hmm. My gosh. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. This has been really, really enlightening, honestly. And for anybody listening who wants to read her book, the book is Sacrifice: The Green Berets, A Fateful Ambush, and the Gold Star Widows Fight for the Truth by Michelle Black. So I read it before this. You'll really go through the full range of emotions, honestly, reading this book. And it's also gives you an incredible minute by minute of everything that happened that day or those 2 days, really, to the team. So if that's the kind of detail that you're looking for, Michelle has certainly put in a lot of work to illuminate that for all of us. So I, really encourage you to pick up that book as well. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. I really appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you so much, Justin.
Take care.
You too.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer: This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.